Chapter 3. Crespi stood on the landing deck of the Innominata and waited patiently, feeling a light sweat build up beneath his uniform cap in spite of the brisk air. Goddamn covers were still made out of some synth-wool blend. More than one soldier in full-dress cax had passed out on a hot day, probably too well trained to take their damn hat off. Particularly not if they were waiting for a superior officer, and definitely not if that officer was an unknown. "Colonel Dr. Crespi? I'm Admiral Thaves." Crespi straightened his shoulders as a short, barrel-chested man walked on deck, calling out to him across the floor. His booming voice reverberated through the high-ceilinged room, as direct and impatient as the heavy stride. Crespi snapped a salute, held it. "Colonel Dr. Anthony Crespi reporting for duty, sir." As Thaves got closer, Crespi studied him discreetly. The Admiral looked nothing like he had pictured. He had heard that Thaves had been a field man for most of his career, but the figure in front of him was soft-looking, his greyed, wavy hair styled slickly back. He did have that old boy air Crespi associated with ancient war holovids, stiff posture in spite of the paunch. But it appeared that the last action Thaves had seen was decades past. On the other hand, the Admiral's face looked as if it had been in every battle waged in the last 50 TS, weathered and lined, cheeks going to jowl. His nose had been broken at least once and badly reset, and was as red as a rotten beet. The burst capillaries spoke of too many 4-star martinis. Thaves stepped in front of him, and then smiled, his teeth even but stained. Crespi caught a faint scent of cigars and hair oil. The Admiral clapped him on the shoulder, as if they were old friends, reunited after years apart. "At ease until further notice, Crespi. Welcome aboard the Innominata." He nodded, grinned wider. "You must have some very influential friends back home. A lot of good men were in line for this post." Thaves turned and started back for the lander door without waiting for an answer. Crespi sighed inwardly and fell in behind. "No influential friends that I'm aware of, sir," he said, careful to keep his tone neutral. "My experience with—" "No nepotism implied, Doctor," Thaves cut him off, held up one meaty hand without even turning to look at him. "Your record speaks for itself. Much sub rosa, eh?" The older man's manner was jovial, but Crespi had the definite impression that Thaves was putting on an act, doing the dance that the brass often seemed to do when they were put up against an unknown. Apparently, he was aware that Crespi had been sent for more than one reason. But how much did Thaves think he knew? He tried again. "Well, to a certain extent, sir. Intelligence was never my strong—" "Yes, most impressive. A good theoretical analyst is always valuable." Thaves finally glanced back at him, grin still in place. "Colonel Dr. Church may well find a use for you." Thaves turned and walked forward again, leading them through the wide mechanical door and into a quiet corridor, military issue, right down to the dark plasticrete wall panels and crappy baseboard heaters. Very inexpensive, and it showed. Cracks and chips of the cheap material dotted the bare floor, mostly around the heating units. They eroded the walls and kept the air in the hall nice and chilly. The atmosphere at this part of the station left something to be desired. The air was recycled, smelled faintly of disinfectant and sweat, and had that strange, flat taint of overuse. Crespi had grown accustomed to it through the years, but somehow it seemed worse than usual. Terrific. And if he recalled the layout properly, they were heading towards officers' quarters. So what was the game? Besides the fact that the Admiral kept interrupting him, he implied that Crespi was NI, that he'd come to dig for dirt. Obviously, the man thought he was more in the loop than he actually was, which could be an asset, depending on how much leeway he could get from it. "Of course, I expect to be working closely with Colonel Dr. Church." The Admiral kept walking, and his response was mumbled in an overly pleasant and distinctively patronizing tone. "Well, nothing is carved in stone." Enough. Crespi frowned and stepped up to walk alongside the Admiral. "Sir, I hope there hasn't been a misunderstanding. My assignment is to succeed Colonel Dr. Lennox as Colonel Dr. Church's research partner." They turned another corner in the hallway, and Thaves motioned to the first in a row of doors, grin in place. "There's your quarters, A89. There's a briefing card in the player. Get familiar with the door. Your orderly is on call. Admiral Thaves, I am here to work with Colonel Dr. Church, am I not? They had stopped in front of his quarters and now faced each other, Crespi looking down at the stocky Admiral. Thaves still smiled, but there was nothing else in his eyes, an aw-shucks look that didn't sit well on his scarred face. That has to be worked out. Why don't you brief yourself and have your orderly show you around? We have a lounge that might surprise you. I would prefer to meet with Colonel Dr. Church and get brought up to speed right away, sir. The Admiral smiled wider, only it didn't look particularly pleasant anymore. It was almost painful, like he was trying to get every tooth into the act, to convince the doctor just how reasonable he was being. Crespi, you have at your disposal the biggest research area on this station. You'll have plenty of time to set up and run any operation you want. For now, though, why don't you relax? Shit-eating. That's the term. Shit-eating grin. Crespi was almost dumbfounded at the man's ability to avoid a direct answer. Thaves went on, the grin turning to a conspiratorial leer. Perhaps you'll find this a bit blunt, but I've found that a little boy-girl action takes the edges off a long, cold sleep. Or, whatever suits your fancy. Now, up in the lounge, you'll find, to be a bit blunt myself, sir, all I want to do is meet Colonel Dr. Church and get to work. To be honest, he was also quite tempted to beat the Admiral's head in with his briefcase, though that would probably seem imprudent at this early juncture. Too bad. Thaves sighed. Well, I'm sorry to have to inform you that Church has determined that he doesn't need a new second in command. But don't worry, you'll have the best research team we can muster. I mean that. Crespi's hands had clenched into fists. He didn't have a particularly quick temper, never with superiors, but this pug-nosed good old boy had pushed it in as far as it would go. Sir, I respectfully request that I meet with Colonel Dr. Church immediately. Not one ruffled feather. Thaves shrugged and held out his hands almost apologetically. Oh well, request denied. Crespi glowered down at him, angrier than he'd been in a long time, almost ready to punch that smarmy little smile through the back of the Admiral's head. Deep breath, Tony. Right. Crespi slowly unfurled his fingers. One, then both hands. Pickman was backing him, and Pickman had a lot more clout than this man. There was no need for this. Crespi lowered his tone, took another deep breath. Admiral Thaves, I have my assignment and I intend to carry it out. If I have to petition superseding authority to do so, I will. Finally, the grin was gone, wiped off clean, and for the first time Crespi saw some of what had gotten Thaves his rank. The Admiral drew himself to full height, and there was a steely coolness in his gaze. Oh my golly, a tough guy. Isn't that fine? Sarcastic, but at least no longer patronizing. Why don't you go and relax in your quarters while I discuss this with Colonel Dr. Church? Thaves scowled up at him, waited. Crespi saluted dutifully. Sir. His commanding officer turned and stalked away, back down the corridor. Crespi opened the door to his new home and threw his briefcase across the room.